The Warrior's Shelter. Chapter 1. The Way to Lantara. In the year 1287, in the distant and rugged land of Astelia, a lone warrior named Kairon embarked on a solemn journey toward the city of Lantara. The kingdom had been restless in recent months, and Kairon carried a sealed message from the northern outpost to the royal court. The contents of the message were unknown to him, but its urgency had been impressed upon him by the commander of the garrison. Riding his faithful donkey, Muro, Kairon departed at first light, wrapped in a thick cloak to guard against the biting wind that swept across the barren plains. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, with dry grass and scattered stones stretching endlessly in all directions. The sky remained overcast, casting a pale gray hue over the landscape, and the air held a chill that hinted at the coming frost. Muro trotted steadily, his hooves crunching over the frozen earth, while Kairon kept a vigilant eye on the horizon. The warrior had traveled these lands before, but never alone and never with such a weight of responsibility. As the day wore on, the sun barely pierced the clouds, and the temperature dropped further. Kairon paused only briefly to let Muro drink from a shallow stream and to eat a handful of dried meat. The wind picked up in the afternoon, carrying dust and brittle leaves across the path, and forcing Kairon to tighten his hood. By dusk, he reached the edge of a vast, empty plain that offered no shelter, no trees, and no signs of habitation. Realizing he would not reach Lantara before nightfall, he decided to make camp. He chose a slight depression in the ground, hoping it would shield him from the wind. From his saddlebag, he retrieved a compact tent made of thick canvas and began to set it up with practiced hands. The stakes were driven deep into the hard soil, and the fabric was stretched taut to resist the gusts. Once the tent was secure, he turned his attention to Muro, removing the saddle and brushing the dust from the donkey coat. He laid a woolen blanket over the animal's back and offered him a small portion of grain, which Muro accepted gratefully. Kairon then filled a wooden bowl with water and placed it near the donkey feet. The creature drank slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. With his companion cared for, Kairon entered the tent and lit a small oil lamp, its flickering flame casting soft shadows on the canvas walls. He ate a modest meal, then wrapped himself in a thick fur-lined cloak and lay down on a mat of woven reeds. Outside, the wind howled across the plain, rattling the tent and carrying with it the distant cries of nightbirds. Kairon closed his eyes, his thoughts lingering on the message he carried and the unknown trials that awaited him in Lantara. Chapter 2. The Night Alarm. The night descended upon the barren plain with a sharp and unforgiving chill. The wind, which had whispered throughout the day, now howled across the open land, sweeping through the sparse grass and rattling the canvas of Kairon's tent. Inside, the warrior lay wrapped in layers of cloth and fur, his body curled tightly against the cold. The small oil lamp flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows on the tent walls. Outside, Muro stood tethered to a gnarled, leafless tree, his breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. The blanket draped over his back offered little protection against the deepening cold, and his body began to tremble. His ears twitched, and his hooves shifted uneasily on the frozen ground. The temperature continued to drop, and the wind carried with it the scent of distant frost. Muro, sensing the warmth emanating from the tent, took cautious steps toward it, his movements slow and deliberate. The rope allowed him just enough slack to reach the edge of the shelter. He lowered his head and nudged the flap gently, the fabric brushing against his nose. Inside, Kairon stirred, awakened by the subtle disturbance. He turned toward the entrance and saw Muro's head peeking through, eyes wide and pleading. The warrior understood the silent request and did not resist. He adjusted the flap, allowing the donkey head to remain inside. Muro stood still, grateful for the reprieve, his breathing calming as the warmth began to soothe his shivering muscles. The wind continued to batter the tent, but the interior remained relatively stable. Kairon lay back down, watching the flickering flame and listening to the rhythmic breathing of his companion. The bond between them, forged through countless journeys, was silent but strong. Hours passed, and the night grew colder still. Frost began to form on the outer edges of the tent, and the ground hardened beneath Muro's hooves. He remained close, his head resting just inside the shelter, eyes half closed in quiet relief. Kairon remained alert, his instincts sharpened by years of travel, but he allowed himself moments of rest, trusting the stillness of the night. The stars above shimmered faintly through the clouded sky, and the plain lay silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind and the soft creak of the tree. The night was long, and the cold relentless, but within the fragile walls of the tent, a small pocket of warmth endured. Kairon and Muro, warrior and beast, shared that space not as master and servant, but as companions bound by necessity and trust. Chapter 3. Concessions. The night deepened over the plains of Astelia, and the cold grew sharper with each passing hour. The wind, relentless and dry, swept across the barren land, carrying with it the chill of distant mountains. Inside the tent, Kairon lay still, wrapped in layers of cloth and fur, listening to the rustling canvas and the occasional creak of the tree to which Muro was tethered. The flickering flame of the oil lamp cast dim light across the interior, illuminating the warrior's weathered face and the sparse belongings arranged neatly beside him. Outside, Muro stood with his head resting inside the tent, his breath forming soft clouds in the air. The warmth from within offered some relief, but the rest of his body remained exposed to the biting wind. His legs trembled, and his hooves shifted uneasily on the frozen ground. After a long moment of hesitation, he lifted one foreleg and nudged it forward, testing the space just beyond the tent's entrance. The canvas gave way slightly, and he managed to slide both front legs inside, settling them on the mat near Kairon's feet. The warrior, sensing the movement, opened his eyes and observed the donkey cautious advance. He did not resist, recognizing the animal's discomfort and trusting its instincts. Muro remained still for a while, adjusting to the new position, his breathing steady and quiet. The wind outside intensified, rattling the tent and causing the flame to flicker more violently. The temperature dropped further, and frost began to form along the edges of the canvas. Muro, emboldened by the partial shelter, shifted his weight and slowly pushed his body forward. His shoulders pressed against the tent's entrance, and with deliberate effort, he maneuvered his torso inside. The space grew tighter, and the canvas stretched slightly under the pressure. Kairon adjusted his position, making room for his companion without complaint. The donkey hind legs remained outside, but most of his body now rested within the fragile warmth of the tent. The interior became cramped, with supplies pushed aside and the mat partially covered by Muro's hooves. Despite the discomfort, Kairon accepted the change, understanding the necessity of the moment. The bond between them, forged through shared hardship, allowed for silent compromise. The wind continued to howl, and the night pressed on with its icy grip. Inside the tent, the two figures, man and beast, endured together, their shared warmth a small defiance against the vast and indifferent cold. Chapter 4. Displacement. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon, the tent had become entirely occupied by Muro. The donkey, having gradually shifted his position throughout the night, now lay curled inside the shelter, his body stretched across the mat and supplies, breathing softly in the warmth that had once belonged to his master. The canvas bulged slightly from the pressure of his frame, and the interior, though cramped, offered him comfort and protection from the lingering cold. Outside, Kairon sat hunched near a small fire he had managed to rekindle with the last of his kindling. His cloak was wrapped tightly around him, but the chill of the early morning pierced through the layers, settling deep into his bones. His face was pale, his eyes weary from a restless night spent exposed to the harsh elements. He watched the flames flicker, their light casting long shadows across the frozen ground, and felt the numbness in his fingers and toes. The wind had calmed slightly, but the air remained bitter, and frost clung to the edges of his boots and the folds of his cloak. Kairon glanced toward the tent, its entrance closed, the shape of Muro visible through the stretched canvas. The donkey slept peacefully, unaware of the discomfort his gradual intrusion had caused. There was no malice in the animal's actions, only instinct and a search for warmth. Kairon understood this, yet the realization weighed heavily on him. His own kindness, offered without boundaries, had led to his displacement. He had allowed each small request, each step inward, until he himself had no space left. The fire crackled softly, offering minimal relief, and Kairon remained still, reflecting on the choices of the night. The plains around him were silent, the sky above a dull gray, and the city of Lantara still lay far beyond the horizon. He knew the journey would resume soon, but for now, he sat in quiet contemplation, accepting the consequences of his generosity. The lesson was clear, etched into the cold morning air and the ache in his limbs. Muro stirred slightly within the tent, shifting his weight and settling again into sleep. Kairon did not disturb him. He simply watched the fire fade, the light of day grow stronger, and the truth of the night settle into his thoughts. Chapter 5. Comprehension. As the first light of dawn spread across the frost-covered plain, Kairon remained seated near the dying embers of his fire, his cloak pulled tightly around his shoulders. The cold had seeped deep into his body during the long hours of the night, and his limbs ached from the strain of remaining outside. The tent, now fully occupied by Muro, stood silent and still, its canvas slightly bulging from the donkey's resting form. Kairon gazed at it without resentment, his thoughts drifting through the events of the previous evening. He recalled each moment of concession, each quiet allowance that had led to his current discomfort. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had gradually evolved into a complete surrender of his space. He had not resisted, believing that compassion required sacrifice, that generosity meant giving without hesitation. Yet now, in the pale morning light, he recognized the flaw in that belief. Kindness, he realized, must be tempered by wisdom. Without boundaries, even the noblest intentions could lead to imbalance. Muro had not acted with malice. The donkey had merely followed instinct, seeking warmth and comfort in the face of the bitter cold. Kairon did not blame him. The animal had no understanding of personal space or shared limits. It was Kairon who had failed to define them, who had allowed each step inward without pause or reflection. The responsibility lay with him, not with the creature that now slept peacefully within the shelter. He understood that leadership, even in the smallest of moments, required clarity and firmness. Compassion did not mean abandoning one's own needs. It meant finding a way to help others without losing oneself in the process. The lesson settled in his mind like the frost on the ground, quiet, sharp, and undeniable. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked a short distance from the camp to observe the horizon. The sky was clear, the air still cold but calm. The journey to Lantara would resume soon, and with it, new challenges and decisions. But Kairon felt change. The night had taught him something essential, something he would carry forward not just in his travels, but in every choice he made. He turned back toward the tent, where Muro remained asleep, and felt no bitterness. Only a quiet resolve to be more mindful, more balanced, and more deliberate in the way he offered his strength to others. Chapter 6. A New Path. As the morning sun rose higher over the frost-covered plains of Astelia, Kairon began to gather his belongings with quiet determination. The embers of the fire had long since faded, leaving only a faint warmth in the soil beneath it. The tent, still slightly misshapen from the night's events, was carefully dismantled and folded into his pack. Muro stood nearby, stretching his legs and shaking off the stiffness of sleep. The donkey appeared content, unaware of the discomfort his actions had caused, and nuzzled the warrior's shoulder as he passed. Kairon responded with a gentle pat, not in resentment but in recognition of their shared journey. The warrior secured his cloak, adjusted the straps of his pack, and checked the message he carried for the king of Lantara. It remained sealed and intact, a reminder of the purpose that had brought him across the cold and unforgiving terrain. With everything in order, he mounted Muro and resumed the path eastward, the city still many miles away. The landscape remained barren, with only distant hills breaking the monotony of the horizon. The wind had softened, and the air, though still cold, carried the promise of a clearer day. As they moved forward, Kairon reflected on the lessons of the night. He understood now that kindness, while noble, must be guided by discernment. Each act of generosity must be weighed against its consequences, not out of selfishness, but out of respect for balance. He had given without pause, and in doing so, had surrendered his own comfort. The experience had not hardened him, but it had made him wiser. He would continue to help those in need, but he would no longer do so at the cost of his own well-being. Muro trotted steadily, his hooves crunching over the frozen earth, and Kairon kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The bond between them remained strong, forged through trials and quiet understanding. The warrior felt no bitterness, only clarity. The journey to Lantara would test him further, but he now carried more than a message. He carried a truth earned through experience. The plains stretched endlessly before them, but Kairon rode with a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned that true strength lies not only in the sword or the shield, but in the wisdom to protect one's own space while still offering warmth to others. The path was long, but he was ready to walk it with a heart both open and guarded. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.